Did you know that even some of the greatest men in the Bible battled deep despair and hopelessness? But they didn't stay there. They found strength, purpose, and hope again. Today, we're going to look at 5 biblical men who struggled with depression but overcame it, and we'll uncover the secrets that helped them move forward. First, we have Elijah, a powerful prophet who performed great miracles, but at one point became so overwhelmed that he asked God to take his life. Then, there's David, the mighty king who wrote many psalms, but also poured out his struggles with fear, loneliness, and sorrow. Job, a man who lost everything, his family, wealth, and health, felt so broken that he wished he had never been born. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, faced rejection and sadness as he tried to warn his people. And finally, even Jesus, in his most difficult moments before the cross, experienced deep sorrow and anguish. Why does this matter? Because depression and sadness are real struggles that many people face today. If these great men of faith went through dark times but still found hope, it means you can too. Their stories remind us that God sees our pain, cares for us, and gives us strength to keep going. If you're feeling down, lost, or overwhelmed, stay with me. You're not alone, and these powerful lessons from the Bible can give you encouragement today. Let's dive in. Elijah, the prophet who wanted to die. Elijah was one of the greatest prophets in the Bible. He performed miracles, boldly spoke God's truth, and even called down fire from heaven to prove that the Lord was the one true God. But despite his victories, Elijah faced a moment of deep despair and fear. After his dramatic showdown with the prophets of Baal, where God displayed his power in an incredible way, Elijah expected things to change for Israel. But instead, Queen Jezebel threatened to kill him. Fear took over, and Elijah ran for his life. He traveled into the wilderness completely exhausted and sat under a tree. He was so discouraged that he prayed, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." 1 Kings 19:4. At that moment, Elijah felt completely alone, overwhelmed, and without hope. But God did not leave Elijah in his despair. Instead of scolding him, God provided what Elijah needed most: rest and nourishment. As Elijah slept, an angel came and touched him, telling him to get up and eat. There, he found bread and water. After eating, he lay down again, and the angel returned to feed him once more. This simple act of care showed that God knew Elijah's exhaustion and wanted to strengthen him physically before addressing his emotions. After Elijah regained his strength, God led him to a cave, where he spoke to him, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a gentle whisper. God reminded Elijah that he was not alone, and that there were still 7,000 faithful people in Israel who had not turned to false gods. God had a plan for him, and his journey was not over. Elijah's story teaches us an important truth. Sometimes the first step to overcoming despair is simply taking care of ourselves. When we are exhausted, hungry, and overwhelmed, we may feel hopeless, just like Elijah. But God shows us that rest and nourishment are essential. It also reminds us that even when we feel alone, we are never truly alone. God is always with us, and He has a plan, even when we don't see it yet. If you are feeling down, take a moment to rest, take care of yourself, and listen for God's gentle voice. He is there, just like He was for Elijah. David, the king who felt abandoned. David is one of the most well-known figures in the Bible. He was a mighty warrior, a great king, and a man after God's own heart. But even David faced moments of deep sadness, fear, and loneliness. His life was filled with battles, betrayal, and loss, and at times he felt completely abandoned. In the book of Psalms, David often poured out his emotions. He wrote in Psalm 42, verse 6, "My soul is downcast within me." This means he felt discouraged, hopeless, and overwhelmed. There were times when his enemies were chasing him, friends had turned against him, and he feared for his life. Even after becoming king, he still faced family troubles and personal failures that made him feel broken. But David didn't keep his pain to himself. He brought it to God. He was completely honest in his prayers, telling God exactly how he felt. He cried out in sorrow, asking, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" Psalm 13:1. He did not hide his struggles, and that honesty became a powerful part of his healing. David also used worship as a way to overcome his pain. Even when he was hurting, he still praised God. In Psalm 42:11, after admitting that his soul was downcast, he encouraged himself by saying, "Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him." Worship reminded him that God was still with him, even in the darkest times. Another way David overcame his struggles was by remembering God's past faithfulness. He often reflected on how God had saved him before. Just like God helped him defeat Goliath when he was young, he trusted that God would help him again. Looking back at past victories gave him hope for the future. David's story teaches us that it's okay to feel sad, afraid, or abandoned. But we don't have to stay there. When we go through tough times, we can follow his example by praying honestly. Tell God exactly how we feel. He listens and cares. Worshiping through the pain. Praising God reminds us of his power and love. Remembering God's faithfulness. Looking back at past blessings can give us hope. If you're feeling down, take a moment to pray, worship, and remind yourself of all the ways God has been faithful before. Just like David, you can find hope again. Job, the man who lost everything. Job was a man who had everything, a loving family, great wealth, and good health. He was also a man of strong faith who honored God in everything he did. But one day, his life completely fell apart. In a short time, Job lost all his children, his wealth, and even his health. He was covered in painful sores, and instead of receiving comfort, his friends accused him of sinning, saying that his suffering must be his own fault. Even his wife told him to curse God and die. Job was completely broken, confused, and in deep pain. At his lowest point, Job cursed the day he was born. In Job 3:11 he asked, "Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb?" He wished he had never lived, because the pain was too much to bear. He didn't understand why God allowed so much suffering in his life. But even in his despair, Job never turned away from God. He didn't pretend to be strong. He cried out in pain and questioned God, but he never gave up on his faith. Instead of walking away from God, he brought his pain to God. In the end, God answered Job. But instead of giving him an explanation, God reminded Job of his power and wisdom. God showed Job that there are things beyond human understanding, and that he is still in control, even when life doesn't make sense. Job humbled himself before God and chose to trust him, even without all the answers. After Job remained faithful, God restored his life. He gave him double the wealth he had before, blessed him with more children, and gave him a long life. But the most important thing Job gained was a deeper trust in God. Job's story teaches us that suffering is sometimes a part of life, but it doesn't mean God has abandoned us. Even when we don't understand why things happen, we can still choose to trust God. Stay faithful in hard times. Even when life is painful, hold on to God. Bring your struggles to Him. It's okay to cry, question, and grieve, but don't turn away from God. Trust even without answers. God is still in control, and He sees the bigger picture. If you're facing loss or hardship, remember Job's story. Your suffering is not the end. God is still working, and He has a plan for you. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Jeremiah was a prophet called by God to warn the people of Israel to turn away from their sins. But instead of listening to him, the people mocked him, rejected him, and even tried to kill him. He was beaten, thrown into prison, and left feeling completely alone. Jeremiah's pain was so deep that he cried out, "Cursed be the day I was born." Jeremiah 20:14. He was tired, discouraged, and felt like his life had no purpose. He didn't want to keep preaching because no one seemed to listen. He felt hopeless and even wished he had never been born. But despite his sadness, Jeremiah never gave up on God. Even when he felt like quitting, he continued doing what God had called him to do. He poured out his emotions to God in prayer, honestly expressing his pain and frustration. But in the middle of his struggles, he also remembered God's promises. One of the most famous verses in the Bible comes from Jeremiah 29:11, where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This verse reminded Jeremiah and us that even when life feels hopeless, God still has a plan. Jeremiah's life was not easy, but he remained faithful. He continued to speak the truth, even when it was hard. He trusted that God's purpose for his life was greater than his temporary pain. Jeremiah's story teaches us that even when we feel rejected, hopeless, or discouraged, God is still working in our lives. God's promises are true. Even in difficult times, God has a purpose and a future for you. Honest prayers bring strength. Like Jeremiah, we can pour out our emotions to God. He hears us. Keep going, despite feelings. We won't always feel strong, but we can still choose to follow God's plan. If you are feeling lost or discouraged, remember that God's plan for you has not changed. Just like Jeremiah, you have a purpose, and God is with you, even in the hardest moments. Jesus, the Savior, who knew deep sorrow. Jesus, the Son of God, knew what it meant to feel deep sorrow. Even though he was perfect and without sin, he still experienced pain, sadness, and loneliness during his time on earth. He loved people, healed the sick, and preached hope. Yet he was betrayed, rejected, and faced great suffering. One of the most intense moments of Jesus' sorrow happened in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before his crucifixion. He knew what was coming. He would be arrested, beaten, and nailed to a cross to die. The weight of this reality was so heavy that he told his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Matthew 26:38. His pain was so intense that he even sweated drops of blood, a rare condition caused by extreme stress. In this moment of deep sorrow, Jesus turned to prayer. He fell to the ground and cried out to God, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Matthew 26:39. Even though he was suffering, he surrendered to God's will. Instead of running away from his mission, he chose to trust his Father completely. Jesus also found strength in his purpose. He knew that his suffering was not meaningless. It was the very reason he came to earth. He was going to die for the sins of the world, bringing salvation to all who would believe in him. This truth gave him the courage to move forward, even when he was in deep distress. Jesus' story teaches us that when we feel overwhelmed, we can find strength in God, just as he did. Pray honestly. Jesus didn't hide his pain. He brought it to God. We should do the same. Surrender to God's will. Even when life is hard, trusting God's plan brings peace. Find strength in purpose. Like Jesus, we can endure struggles when we remember that God has a greater purpose for our lives. If you are feeling deep sorrow, you are not alone. Jesus understands your pain, and just as he found strength in God, you can too. Seek God's presence, surrender to his will, and trust that he will give you the strength to keep going. We've just looked at 5 powerful stories of men in the Bible who battled deep sorrow and despair, yet found a way to overcome. Let's quickly recap what we learned. Elijah was exhausted and wanted to die, but God gave him rest, nourishment, and a renewed purpose. David felt abandoned and broken, but he found healing through honest prayer, worship, and remembering God's faithfulness. Job lost everything, but he remained faithful and learned to trust God even without answers. Jeremiah faced rejection and deep sorrow, but he held on to God's promises and kept fulfilling his mission. Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow in Gethsemane, but he found strength in prayer, surrender, and his divine purpose. Each of these men struggled, but they didn't stay in their despair. They found hope, and so can you. No matter what you're facing, remember that God is with you, and he has a plan for your life. Which of these stories spoke to you the most? Comment below and share your thoughts. Your story could encourage someone else who needs to hear it. If this video encouraged you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more faith-filled content. Let's continue growing in faith together. See you in the next video.